Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Dunst, and I teach philosophy and humanities courses at Westmoreland County Community College. In this video, I'd like to discuss one of America's most foundational yet contentious principles, free speech. I'm going to take you on a journey through the philosophical underpinnings, legal evolution, and contemporary challenges of the First Amendment. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand not just what free speech means legally, but why it remains one of the most debated and evolving concepts in American democracy. Let me begin with a deceptively simple question. What is free speech really for? Is it about finding the truth? Protecting individual dignity? Enabling democracy? Or perhaps preventing government tyranny? As we'll see, the answer is all of these things. And the tensions between them create the amazing complexity of First Amendment jurisprudence. At the heart of American free speech doctrine lies our first fundamental tension, the battle between discovering truth and preventing harm. This isn't just an academic question. It shapes how courts decide real cases involving real people whose lives hang in the balance of these decisions. Let's start with the marketplace of ideas theory, the belief that truth emerges through competition between ideas. This concept, most famously articulated by Justice Holmes in his dissent in Abrams v. United States, suggests that just as economic markets theoretically produce efficient outcomes through competition, the intellectual marketplace should allow the best ideas to rise to the top while bad ideas fade away. But here's the critical question that we have to ask. Is this always true? Do some voices drown out others? Might misinformation and propaganda spread more effectively than truth? When we look at our current information environment, these aren't just theoretical concerns, they're daily realities. The marketplace metaphor assumes equal access and rational consumers, but what happens when some participants have megaphones while others can only whisper? Or when consumers are deliberately manipulated? This brings us to what Justice Louis Brandeis called the counter-speech doctrine in Whitney v. California. Brandeis argued that we should embrace more speech, not censorship, as a remedy for bad speech. The idea is elegant. If someone spreads lies, others should counter with truth. If someone promotes harmful ideas, others should respond with better ideas. But we also have to confront the troubling reality that there may be some forms of speech that shouldn't be allowed to compete in the so-called marketplace because their harms outweigh the benefits. For example, what about speech designed not to seek truth, but to destroy the very possibility of rational discourse? What about disinformation campaigns specifically engineered to overwhelm counterspeech through volume and repetition? This leads us to the harm principle, borrowed from John Stuart Mill's philosophy. The idea that we must constantly balance free speech expression against preventing concrete harms to individuals and to society. The challenge is defining what constitutes harm worthy of restricting speech. Are some harms like psychological distress, discrimination, or physical violence so severe and direct that they justify restrictions on speech? Consider this dilemma. Mill's harm principle seemed clear in the 19th century when most speech reached small, local audiences. But what happens when a single social media post can reach millions within minutes and trigger real-world violence? The temporal and spatial scales have changed dramatically, but our constitutional framework hasn't necessarily kept pace. Our second major tension involves the relationship between individual rights and collective needs. On one side stands a powerful principle. Speech is fundamental to human dignity and self-realization. The ability to express our thoughts, beliefs, and identity is what makes us fully human. This right lies at the core of individual autonomy. But this right is not absolute and must be balanced against the rights of others to be free from harassment, intimidation, and discrimination. This creates what's called the heckler's veto problem. Here's the question. Is a speaker fully responsible for the effect their speech has on their audience? If an audience can silence speech by being offended, is this intolerable censorship? Think about this scenario. A controversial speaker comes to campus. Their message so offends or angers listeners that violence threatens to erupt. Should we silence the speaker to prevent that violence, even though they weren't the ones making the threats? If we do, haven't we created a system where the most intolerant voices effectively control what can be said in public? This brings us to a crucial distinction between constitutionally protected speech and the social value of free expression. The government might be required by the First Amendment to allow certain forms of harmful speech, but that doesn't mean such speech is good or valuable or worthy of support as citizens. The tension deepens when we consider democratic participation. Free speech is supposed to be a prerequisite for self-governance. Citizens need access to information and the ability to debate public issues. But here's the paradox. If free speech can be used to undermine democracy itself, through the spread of disinformation aimed at suppressing votes or inciting political violence, should it protect speech that seeks to dismantle the very system that guarantees its freedom? This isn't hypothetical. We've seen how information warfare can exploit our commitment to open discourse, to attack democratic institutions themselves. When bad actors use democratic freedoms to destroy democracy, we face what political scientists call the democratic paradox. Finally, there's the perpetual tension between protecting offensive speech and maintaining social cohesion. Every society needs some level of mutual respect and civil discourse in order to function. But enforcing civility through legal restrictions risks creating a bland, homogenized public sphere where controversial ideas are suppressed in the name of social harmony. Our third core tension involves when and how the government can restrict speech. The foundational principle here is the presumption against censorship, that prior restraints are presumptively unconstitutional. The government generally can't stop speech before it occurs. It can only punish it afterward if it causes legally recognized harm. This presumption grows from hard-won historical experience. When governments can decide in advance what speech to allow, they have enormous power to suppress criticism and control public debate. It's far better to let speech occur and then address any harms through subsequent legal action. But, in certain circumstances, prior restraint becomes a necessary evil to prevent immediate and irreversible harm. The classic example involves revealing troop movements during wartime. By the time you punish that speech after publication, soldiers are dead and battles are lost. The challenge lies in determining what constitutes sufficient justification for this drastic step. How immediate must the harm be? How irreversible? How certain? These questions become even more complex in our digital age, where speech can have global consequences within seconds of publication. This leads us to the critical distinction between content-based and content-neutral restrictions. Content-based restrictions target speech because of its message. They involve different levels of scrutiny for restrictions based on message versus manner of delivery. These face the strictest constitutional review because they're most likely to reflect government bias and censorship. Content-neutral restrictions regulate the time, place, or manner of speech without regard to its message. A noise ordinance that applies equally to all speakers would be content-neutral. These receive more lenient judicial review because they're less likely to be motivated by hostility to particular viewpoints. But here's where theory meets reality. Each seemingly neutral regulation, such as those on noise levels or protest permits, can disproportionately affect disprivileged groups and their messages. A permitting system might be neutral on paper, but if it's administered in a discriminatory way, it becomes a tool of censorship. The time, place, manner doctrine allows the government to regulate how speech occurs without restricting its content. You can't use a megaphone at 3 a.m. in a residential neighborhood, regardless of your message's importance. The crucial requirement is that the government may only impose such restrictions if ample alternative channels for communications are available. But what constitutes an adequate alternative in the digital age? If the government restricts social media access, but suggests people can still write letters to newspapers, is that meaningful? What if there are no real alternatives to the dominant communication platforms of our time? The Supreme Court has evolved through several tests for determining when speech can be restricted, and understanding this evolution helps us see how constitutional doctrine adapts to changing circumstances while maintaining its core principles. The journey began with the clear and present danger test from Schenck versus United States in 1919. This standard held that speech could be restricted when it creates an immediate threat. Justice Holmes famously wrote that the First Amendment wouldn't protect someone falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. But the Schenck standard proved problematic in application. During World War I and the Red Scare, courts used it to uphold convictions of socialists and other political dissidents whose speech was far from creating imminent violence. The danger often seemed theoretical, and the present requirement was stretched beyond recognition. By 1951, in Dennis v. United States, the court had moved to the gravity of evil test, which involved balancing the severity of potential harm against the probability of success in achieving evil ends. This approach allowed courts to consider not just immediacy, but the seriousness of the threatened harm and the likelihood of occurrence. This test enabled the conviction of Communist Party leaders during the Cold War, even though their speech involved abstract advocacy rather than direct incitement to violence. The court reasoned that the potential harm, violent overthrow of the government, was so grave that even a small probability justified restriction. The modern standard emerged in 1969 with Brandenburg v. Ohio, establishing the imminent lawless action test we still use today. Under Brandenburg, speech might be restricted only when it's directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and is likely to incite or produce such action. This represents a much more protective standard. It requires specific intent to cause immediate violence, and a high likelihood that such violence will actually occur. Abstract advocacy of illegal activity receives full protection. Only direct incitement to imminent violence can be punished. Brandenburg reflects several crucial insights about how speech actually functions in society. There's usually a temporal gap between speech and action that allows for reflection and counter-speech. People don't automatically commit crimes just because they hear radical ideas. And governments have proven notoriously bad at predicting which speech will actually cause harm. Rather than applying uniform standards to all expressions, the court has identified categories of speech with different protection levels. This categorical approach recognizes that not all speech serves the same democratic values or personal interests. At the top sits fully protected speech, subject to few or no restrictions. This includes political speech, artistic expression, and most offensive speech. Political speech receives the highest protection because it's most directly connected to democratic self-governance. Citizens must have access to information about candidates, policies, and public issues to make informed electoral choices. Artistic expression also receives strong protection based on its contribution to cultural dialogue and individual self-realization. Even disturbing or controversial art usually can't be banned, though it might face reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. The protection of offensive speech might seem counterintuitive, but it reflects a crucial insight. The speech most needing constitutional protection is precisely the speech that majorities find objectionable. Popular opinions rarely need legal protection. Partially protected speech occupies the middle tier and can face some restrictions. Commercial speech, advertising and marketing, falls in this category. While commercial speech provides valuable consumer information, it's primarily motivated by profit rather than democratic participation or personal expression, so the government has a little bit more regulatory leeway. Speech by public employees also receives reduced protection. Government workers don't forfeit all First Amendment rights, But courts recognize that the government has special interests as an employer in maintaining workplace efficiency and public confidence. At the bottom lies unprotected speech, which the government is free to restrict entirely. This includes true threats, incitement to imminent lawless action, obscenity, and defamation within limitations. These categories reflect judgments that certain speech types cause serious harm when contributing little to democratic discourse or individual expression. But these boundaries aren't fixed. Courts constantly litigate and refine the lines between protected and unprotected speech, especially as new forms of communication emerge and social understanding of harm evolves. The Supreme Court has developed sophisticated doctrinal frameworks, recognizing that identical words can have vastly different implications depending on context. Where and how speech occurs matters enormously for its constitutional protection. The public forum doctrine establishes different rules for different government properties. In traditional public forums, like streets, parks, and sidewalks, public meeting places, the government can only restrict time, place, and manner in content-neutral ways. These spaces have historically served public assembly and debate, so citizens have strong expressive rights there. In limited or non-public forums, like military bases and public school classrooms, the government has wide latitude to restrict speech, as long as the rules are reasonable and don't target a specific viewpoint. These spaces primarily serve other purposes, so free speech rights must be balanced accordingly. The captive audience doctrine recognizes that whether listeners can avoid the speech determines when the listener's right to be left alone outweighs the speaker's right to free expression. The landmark case Cohen v. California illustrates this principle perfectly. When a man wore a jacket reading "Fuck the draft" in a courthouse, the court protected his expression, reasoning, if you don't like the jacket, nobody's making you look at it. But our assessment of whether an audience is captive becomes more uncertain in confined spaces like public transportation, workplaces, or school settings where listeners can't easily escape unwanted messages. The distinction between government as speaker versus the government as sovereign clarifies when the government is regulating speech versus expressing its own message. As sovereign, the government must remain viewpoint neutral. It can't favor some political messages over others. As speaker, the government can say any biased thing it wants. It can promote its own policies through public campaigns, educational curricula, or monument displays. This distinction explains why the government can't ban political protest, but can create public service announcements supporting particular policies. The government has its own expressive interests alongside its regulatory responsibilities. When courts allow restrictions on protected speech, they apply strict scrutiny, requiring the government to meet several demanding tests. Understanding these requirements helps explain why most speech restrictions fail constitutional review. First, the government must demonstrate a compelling government interest, providing that its speech restriction is necessary to achieve a very important goal, like national security, preventing an imminent and concrete threat to public safety, or protecting a vulnerable group from harm. This standard, established in Brandenburg v. Ohio, sets a very high bar on government restrictions of speech. The interest must be genuinely compelling, not merely convenient or popular. Administrative efficiency, avoiding offense, or maintaining social harmony typically don't qualify. The threat must be concrete and immediate, not speculative or theoretical. Second, any restriction must be narrowly tailored. As established in United States v. O'Brien, the government law or policy must be precisely and narrowly focused on achieving the compelling interest, without restricting more speech than is absolutely necessary. The restriction can't be overbroad. It can't sweep in protected speech along with unprotected speech. This requirement forces the government to use surgical rather than sledgehammer approaches. If the goal is preventing violence at public events, a total demonstration ban would be overbroad. More targeted measures like crowd control or weapons restrictions would be more likely to satisfy the test. Third, the government must show it considered less restrictive alternatives, that it explored and rejected other less speech-restrictive ways to achieve its goal. This requirement treats speech restrictions as a last resort, reflecting the principle that, given free expression's importance to democratic society, we should exhaust alternatives before turning to censorship. However, history shows how these demanding standards can be manipulated during times of crisis. The tragic example of Korematsu versus United States demonstrates this failure. The court then claimed that national security required Japanese-American internment, that the program was narrowly tailored to military necessity, and that no less restrictive alternatives existed. History has thoroughly discredited these judgments, reminding us that constitutional principles are only as strong as the institutions and government officials applying them. Certain institutional settings require modified free speech approaches because they involve unique government interests or power relationships. Let me walk you through the three most important contexts. In educational settings, the foundational principle from Tinker versus the Des Moines School District holds that students retain rights, but schools have a broader authority to restrict speech that would substantially disrupt the educational environment or infringe on the rights of others. Students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, but neither do they have unlimited expression rights. Schools must balance student expression against their educational mission. A student wearing a political armband receives protection, but speech that disrupts classroom learning or threatens other students doesn't. The challenge lies in defining substantial disruption in practice, especially as student online speech increasingly affects school environments. For public employment, courts balance a government employee's right to speak as a private citizen on a matter of public concern against the government's interest in maintaining a functional and efficient workplace. The foundational case, Pickering versus Board of Education, established this balancing test, while Garcetti versus Ceballos clarified that government employees have no First Amendment protection when speaking in their official capacity. This creates difficult line-drawing problems in practice. When is a teacher speaking as an educator versus as a private citizen? What about social media posts by police officers? The boundaries between professional and personal speech continue to blur, especially in the digital age. In military and prison contexts, the government's need to maintain order, discipline, and security is weighed more heavily than individual expression rights. Military personnel have significantly reduced free speech protections, as seen in Parker v. Levy, because military effectiveness depends on unit cohesion and clear command structures. Similarly, prisoners retain some rights, but officials have broad authority under Turner v. Safley to restrict speech that threatens institutional security. These special contexts remind us that free speech rights exist within broader institutional structures that serve vital social functions. While the First Amendment provides crucial protections, those protections must sometimes accommodate other essential interests. Throughout First Amendment history, certain fundamental tensions repeatedly surface in different forms. Understanding these recurring dilemmas is essential for grasping why free speech cases are so difficult and why reasonable people often reach different conclusions. The first tension involves democracy versus majoritarianism. The core of the First Amendment lies in protecting unpopular speech from hostile majorities. The Skokie, Illinois Nazi March case, where a neo-Nazi group marched in a community with a large Jewish population and many Holocaust survivors, perfectly illustrates this principle. Even when an entire community finds speech abhorrent, constitutional protection remains vital. As the Supreme Court recognized in Terminiello versus City of Chicago, it's vitally crucial for a free and open society to ensure robust debate, even when it disturbs social peace. This principle reflects the understanding that if free speech only protected popular opinions, we wouldn't need constitutional protection at all. Democracy requires space for minority viewpoints to challenge majority assumptions, even when that challenge is deeply uncomfortable. The second recurring tension involves formal legal equality versus substantive material equality. Our legal system promises equal access to speech platforms, But structural inequalities mean some voices are exponentially louder than others. Should the government maintain neutrality facing these inequalities, or take affirmative steps to ensure diverse voices are heard? This tension plays out in debates over campaign finance, media ownership, and platform regulation. Some argue that formal equality, treating all speakers the same under the law, is sufficient. Others contend that without addressing structural inequalities in speech power, formal equality becomes meaningless. The third tension involves individual liberty versus collective harm. First Amendment doctrine strongly protects individual expression, but what about speech that systematically harms entire groups? The court briefly embraced group defamation laws in Beauharnais versus Illinois, but the Supreme Court has moved away from punishing speech that harms a group's reputation. The modern approach, exemplified in Cohen versus California, emphasizes personal autonomy over social solidarity and civility, that individuals have the right to express their views in a way that rings true to them, even when it disturbs social harmony. The profane anti-war jacket couldn't be censored, even though it offended courthouse visitors. But critics argue this individualistic approach ignores how speech can systematically silence vulnerable groups. When hate speech creates hostile environments that effectively exclude certain voices from public discourse, does protecting individual speakers actually undermine the speech rights of those who are marginalized? Finally, there's the ongoing challenge of technological evolution versus constitutional principles. The difficult work of figuring out how to apply 18th century principles to digital age communications. Cases like Counterman versus Colorado, dealing with online threats, illustrate the challenge. Traditional public forum concepts struggle with social media platforms, leading to complex questions about whether and how constitutional principles should adapt. The court has consistently held that platforms are private companies and not state actors, allowing them to set their own content moderation rules, which can feel like censorship sometimes, but doesn't violate the First Amendment. This creates the paradox where the most powerful censorship in modern society is perfectly legal under current doctrine. The Supreme Court's approach has generally moved towards greater speech protection over time, driven by several philosophical commitments that reflect deeper changes in American society and constitutional understanding. The first driving force is distrust of government censorship, recognition that officials have incentives to suppress criticism. This skepticism has grown stronger over time, as historical experience has repeatedly demonstrated how even well-intentioned restrictions can be abused. But how does this interact with the unitary executive theory and expanding executive power? This tension remains unresolved. The second factor is faith in the democratic process, belief that citizens can distinguish truth from falsehood when given access to information. This optimistic view of human reason has deep roots in Enlightenment thinking. However, this assumption is getting much more difficult to believe in our current miasmatic information environment, where sophisticated manipulation techniques can exploit cognitive biases. Third is acceptance of pluralistic society, recognition that robust democracy requires protecting offensive to disturbing speech. This reflects growing comfort with social diversity and competing values. Yet, there are growing concerns about democratic backsliding and the soft use of power to produce chilling effects on free expression. Finally, there's growing emphasis on individual dignity, seeing speech as fundamental to human autonomy and self-realization. This reflects broader cultural shifts towards individualism and personal expression. However, this emphasis is increasingly contrasted with concerns over mental health and bullying. Which values should supersede when they conflict? These philosophical commitments have generally expanded speech protection, but they also create new tensions as social conditions change and our understanding of speech's effects evolves. Now we turn to the contemporary challenges reshaping free speech doctrine in real time. The digital revolution has fundamentally altered how we communicate, who controls public discourse, and what kinds of harm speech can cause. The most significant challenge involves social media as the new public square and the concentration of platform power. Facebook, Twitter or X, YouTube, etc. effectively control public discourse, but they aren't bound by First Amendment restrictions because they're private companies. This creates unprecedented private censorship power. The key questions multiply rapidly. What obligations do platforms have regarding algorithmic transparency? If platforms have none, aren't they bound by editorial responsibility like traditional publishers? When a handful of corporate executives can determine what billions see and say, haven't we effectively privatized the First Amendment? Platform monopolization means a few technology companies control discourse access for global populations. When these platforms remove content or suspend users, they can silence voices more effectively than any government censor in history. Yet, because they're private entities, their editorial decisions don't trigger constitutional protection. Algorithmic curation adds another layer of complexity. AI systems shape what speech gets seen by determining feed content, creating invisible editorial decisions with little public oversight. These algorithms don't just host speech, they actively curate it, making editorial choices about what deserves attention. Finally, there are entanglement issues. When does government pressure on platforms become state censorship? Recent litigation has explored whether official requests for content removal constitute state action, triggering First Amendment protections. This becomes particularly prominent during COVID-19, as agencies worked with platforms to combat health misinformation. The rise of AI and synthetic media presents unprecedented verification and attribution challenges that current free speech doctrine wasn't designed to address. Truth verification becomes critical. How do we distinguish authentic from AI-generated or deepfake content? When synthetic media can create convincing recordings of people saying or doing things they never actually said or did, how do we maintain any shared basis for factual discourse? The technology creates chilling effects, even without direct censorship. Fear of being deepfaked may deter legitimate speech. People might avoid controversial positions, knowing they could be framed through synthetic media. This invisible self-censorship might be more powerful than formal restrictions. Attribution problems multiply. Who's responsible for AI speech? The programmer who created the system? The user who operated it? The platform that hosted the result? Or some hybrid of all three? Traditional legal frameworks assume human speakers making deliberate choices, but AI speech complicates these assumptions fundamentally. As AI-generated content becomes more sophisticated and widely available, these questions become increasingly urgent for courts, platforms, and society generally. Perhaps the gravest challenge to traditional free speech doctrine comes from deliberate attacks on democratic discourse itself. Foreign adversaries have learned to weaponize American free speech principles against American democracy. Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns represent state-sponsored manipulation of American public discourse. These aren't random bad actors, they're sophisticated operations designed to exploit our commitment to open debate in order to undermine democratic institutions. This creates tension between sovereignty and openness. How do we protect democratic process and integrity while maintaining the open debate that democracy requires? Traditional doctrine assumes that more speech leads to better outcomes. But what happens when bad actors flood the system with false information specifically designed to prevent truth from emerging? We're entering what some call a post-truth environment, where we no longer share factual foundations for debate. When citizens inhabit completely different information universes, democratic deliberation becomes impossible. Free speech assumes shared commitment to truth-seeking and democratic norms. What happens when we can no longer rely on these assumptions? Echo chambers created by algorithmic amplification of confirmation bias mean we now live in entirely different information worlds than each other. We're not just disagreeing about policy, we're disagreeing about basic empirical reality. This raises fundamental questions about democratic legitimacy. Free speech relies on shared commitment to democratic norms. What happens when we can't assume that commitment anymore? When some actors use free speech not to participate in democracy, but to destroy it? The economic model funding digital platforms creates its own set of free speech problems through data collection and behavioral manipulation. Behavioral targeting allows micro-targeting of political messages to specific psychological profiles. When political communications can be precisely tailored to individual psychological vulnerabilities, does this enhance democratic participation or manipulate it? Are citizens making informed choices or being psychologically manipulated? Surveillance creates chilling effects. The mere possibility of mass data collection creates self-censorship effects. When people know their communications might be monitored and recorded, they modify their behavior even without formal legal restrictions. This invisible censorship might be more powerful than government restrictions. Anonymous speech has historically played crucial roles in political discourse. Think of the Federalist Papers, published under pseudonyms. But online anonymity also enables abuse that can silence other voices. How do we protect legitimate pseudonymous expression while preventing its weaponization? The European concept of a right to be forgotten, data erasure from online platforms and search engines, directly conflicts with American free speech principles that generally oppose content removal. In an environment where information lives forever online, shouldn't people have some ability to move past mistakes or control personal information? Doxing and harassment represent new forms of silencing through privacy violations. When personal information is weaponized to threaten and intimidate, the result is that privacy violations effectively silence speakers who might otherwise participate in public discourse. The digital economy has created new forms of economic control over expression that challenge traditional free speech frameworks. The creator and influencer economy blurs lines between genuine expression and sponsored content, commerce, and social manipulation. When social media personalities promote products or political messages, are they engaging in authentic speech or paid advertising? Traditional disclosure requirements struggle with these hybrid forms. Demonetization and deplatforming function as censorship by cutting revenue streams or access to audiences. Platforms can effectively silence creators without formal censorship, simply by eliminating their ability to make a living from their speech. When economic survival depends on platform access, the threat of removal becomes economic coercion. Subscription models and paywalls make access to democratic discourse and quality of information increasingly dependent on class privilege. If informed citizenship requires access to quality journalism, but that access costs money, we risk creating a system where democratic participation becomes a privilege rather than a right. Social manipulation through surveillance capitalism goes beyond advertising to actually shaping consumers and voters to behave as desired. When platforms can use psychological profiles to influence not just what people buy, but how they vote, the line between commercial speech and political manipulation disappears. Dark money, facilitated by cryptocurrency, enables untraceable political spending, creating new challenges for campaign finance transparency and democratic accountability. Finally, the technological infrastructure underlying digital communication raises fundamental questions about access and control that our constitutional framework hasn't fully addressed. Net neutrality involves ISP control over speech access and bandwidth prioritization. If internet service providers can slow down or prioritize certain content, they gain editorial control over what speech reaches audiences. Is internet access a censorable privilege or a First Amendment right? Courts haven't definitively answered this question yet. Decentralization through blockchain and peer-to-peer alternatives offers potential solutions to platform control, but creates new problems. When no central authority controls the network, how do we prevent it from being overrun by harmful content while maintaining its censorship resistance? We can also ask questions about switching from one social platform to another. So interoperability questions arise. Must social media and gaming platforms allow cross-platform communication, or can they use vendor lock-in to control users' access to speech? These technical decisions have profound implications for speech markets and user autonomy. Government surveillance capabilities now enable monitoring of virtually all digital communications, as Edward Snowden revealed through programs like PRISM. These create potential Fourth Amendment violations while also chilling First Amendment expression through the knowledge that all communications might be monitored. As we reach the end of this journey through American free speech doctrine, it's worth reflecting on how these enduring philosophical tensions, truth versus harm prevention, individual autonomy versus social order, prior restraint versus subsequent punishment, continue to play out in radically new contexts. The Supreme Court's historical movement towards greater speech protection reflects important insights about government censorship dangers and open discourse values. The Brandenburg Standard provides strong protection for political dissent. Its categorical approach recognizes that different types of speech serve different social functions. But these frameworks emerged in a media environment quite different than what we're facing today. When most speech reached small audiences through editorial gatekeepers, the harms from bad speech seemed manageable through counterspeech and social norms. Today's environment allows instant global reach without editorial filters, creating harm possibilities that traditional framework wasn't designed to address. Private platform power challenges fundamental assumptions about how free speech works practically. If technology companies control discourse access, formal government neutrality might not ensure meaningful speech opportunities for everybody. We might need approaches addressing private censorship while preserving editorial freedom and innovation. Information warfare raises even deeper questions about whether traditional doctrine can defend democracy against sophisticated informational attacks. When adversaries use our commitment to open discourse as a weapon against democratic institutions, we face a fundamental paradox. Saving democracy might require limiting some democratic freedoms. These challenges don't have easy solutions, and reasonable people disagree about appropriate responses. Some advocate expanded platform regulations. Others worry such regulation would create new censorship opportunities. Some want stronger anti-disinformation tools. Others fear that these would suppress legitimate dissent. What seems clear is that the free speech conversation continues to evolve. Each generation has to determine how to apply foundational principles to new circumstances and new challenges. The framers gave us a commitment to free expression, but they didn't provide a detailed implementation manual for every possible situation, and they couldn't. That work, then, falls to us. Courts, legislators, platform executives, and ordinary citizens navigating these complex issues in real time. How we resolve tensions between freedom and responsibility, individual expression and collective welfare, democratic openness and democratic survival will shape the society we leave to future generations. The First Amendment embodies an aspiration rather than a fixed rule. It commits us to the ongoing project of creating a society where diverse voices can be heard, where truth can emerge through open dialogue, where individuals can express their authentic selves, and where democratic self-governance remains possible. That project requires constant vigilance, thoughtful balancing, and good faith engagement with difficult questions. Thank you for your interest and attention. I truly appreciate you taking the time to learn about this absolutely vital civic topic. Take care.